Hey, everybody, welcome back to You Are What You Love. Today, my guest is a university student and a listener of the podcast, which is really excited to be able to bring someone in who has been listening since really towards the beginning of the show with Mike Schubert and our episode on Bo Burnham. So, I am excited to welcome a university student who is an enthusiastic enjoyer of things. She's currently studying psychology, and her name is Mahi. So, please welcome Mahi to the podcast.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me. I'm really excited to have you on. I have been really excited about sort of like how this show has kind of allowed me to get back into the power of the internet connecting with people. It's like a phase that I feel like I haven't been in since high school when I was really making friends and connections through the internet. And now it's sort of like the reverse of getting to connect with people through fandom again. So it was really exciting to be able to have you on and have that version of fandom and the internet exist again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also like, oh, this is so cool. I get to like talk about something I love for like a good while. This is excellent.
Yeah, it's just the dream of just anything that you don't get to talk about normally,
Yeah,
feel free.
exactly.
Well, why don't we dive into it? What are we talking about today? What's the piece of media that sort of shaped who you are as a person?
Yeah, so the piece of media I'll be talking about is the sitcom The Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, I was excited to do this one because I realized no one has picked a sitcom yet, which is a little wild because it feels like sitcoms are so much of like our shaping of sort of American culture, of comedy, of sort of network television. A lot of people start watching sort of the building blocks of TV and comedy are sitcoms. So it was exciting that you picked one.
Yeah, like I also saw a small disclaimer, I'm not North American, so it's very like
Right.
interesting like coming across like everyone's watched this thing, but I'm like from a different continent and that's really fun.
Yeah, we emailed a little bit about this, and I'm excited to kind of hear about your path. But now you're studying in Canada, so you are not originally from North America. Where did you come over from, and where did you grow up?
So yeah, I'm from Ethiopia. That's where I mostly grew up, but I also did travel around just for my mom's work. So whenever she moved somewhere, she'd take my brother and I with her. So I grew up kind of a little bit all over the place, but I'm originally from Ethiopia.
What part of Ethiopia are you from?
So I'm just from the main city, Addis Ababa.
What made you decide to study in Canada and to leave home?
Couple of things. One is, education system is like slightly better up here. But also just by virtue of because I traveled around, I didn't go through the national exams from my country, so I technically wouldn't
Mm.
qualify for like university back at home.
Oh,
So
fair
yeah.
enough. Generally reasonable reasons.
Mhm.
Well, so for anybody who has not somehow seen or heard of The Big Bang Theory, what would you say the show is about in like a non-spoilery minute pitch?
Yeah, so The Big Bang Theory is this sitcom about roommates, Leonard and Sheldon, and their group of friends who are like all of them are like scientists, and they are all incredible nerds. And I think the show starts when neighbor Penny moves in, and kind of shenanigans ensue from there.
Yeah, I think that show I feel like has been so well known for so long. It's been on for a really long time, or it's not on anymore, obviously, but it was on
Mhm.
for so long. And then you've got Young Sheldon after, and it's a pretty well known piece of media, I feel. How did you discover the show? When did you start watching it?
Right. So I think I started watching it when I was like 8. Because a lot of me starting watching TV shows is like my dad used to watch a lot. He was a bit of an insomniac when I was younger, so he would just watch a lot of shows. I didn't start it wasn't the first like series I've ever watched. I think I started out with Friends, and I've
Mm.
had a very long Friends phase. But my mom, and I remember this so distinctly. So my mom was very much like, "Is this age appropriate for her to watch?" Like she's 8, and she was having this discussion with one of my uncles, and he was like, "Oh, I feel like Big Bang Theory might be a sitcom that she can watch, and like it's not that like inappropriate." And my mom was like, still, I prefer she just watch cartoons." But I was like, "Big Bang Theory, that's another one my dad watches. Let me try that one out." And then I got hooked. Yeah, so it was really cool. And it's also like one of those things. So sitcoms usually we watch as a family. Like it's me, my dad, and sometimes my brother, depending on the show. I think Big Bang Theory is one of them where it was all three of us that used to watch it. So yeah.
Did you guys watch it like every week as a family, like as it aired?
No. So, my dad had this hard drive that he would download all of these shows, and I think we started watching it back when it was I was 8, so it was like what, 2009 or something. So only like a couple of seasons when it first came out. So my dad had the whole thing on his hard drive, so we would just kind of binge watch it before like bed or something. Like, yeah.
Oh, very cool. So your dad was a big sitcom fan at the time when you started.
Yeah, sitcoms, TV shows, like, I know like, back then, he was just watching, like, a whole bunch of stuff, like, that's how I got introduced to, like, Grey's Anatomy, Prison Break, Desperate
Oh, Prison Break.
Housewives.
The classics.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so fun. That's what's interesting about that is those are not like stereotypically dad shows, like Desperate
No.
Housewives.
But that was, like, my dad and I used to, like, binge watch that, like, it was, like, we
Oh,
would
it's
have
so
discussions
good.
about it. It's so funny being, like, 10 and talking to my dad about that show, like, that was just so funny.
Oh, I love that. That's very there's a very sweet image in that of just
Yeah.
like I of certainly Desperate Housewives has got some shall we say mature subject matter.
True, but it's like it flew right over my head because I was 10,
Oh, of
so
course, 'cause you were
it's
10. Yeah.
yeah, so it was just anything that wasn't, like, too mature, or like, something that I could grasp, like, we would talk about, it was just fun, but yeah.
Oh, I love that. So you had like a almost like a little TV club with your dad every night.
Kinda, yeah, but then I got, like, more obsessive about it, and so he would be like, "Alright, time for bed," and I would be the one who would sit up and, like, binge through an entire, like, season of a show, so
So, was TV watching, like, always, like, a family affair that you were doing with your family each time, or was it something that you kind of broke off eventually and, like you said, you just started binging?
yeah, so it just kinda started out with, like, watching the episodes while my dad was, he'd be in bed on his laptop and watching something, and I would just climb in next to him and start watching, but then at a certain point, I would just grab the hard drive and watch it by myself because 'cause I'm like, "I need to know what happens," and because my dad is very, like, structured as a person, so he's very much like, "Okay, I'm gonna eat dinner, and then I'm gonna watch the news a little bit with your mom, and then I'm gonna go to bed and watch TV." Whereas I'm like, "I finished school, and I have no homework, so I need to watch, and I need to know what happens next." So I just
Oh.
at that point, just started watching it by myself.
Do you remember what point or what thing happened that made you go, like, "I'm not waiting for you anymore, I have to know what happens next?"
No, not really. I think at a certain point, I'm just like, I don't know, I just needed the dopamine hits, I guess, so I just, like, kept going.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, I think it's interesting too that you're it almost sounds like your dad was making his own Netflix, like, kind of binging his own situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, I think we only in Ethiopia, we got access to Netflix, I think when I was in, like, high school, maybe, like, 11th
Mm.
grade. So, up until then, it's either whatever you can get on TV or, you could go to places and you can, like, buy, like, either DVDs or you can get them downloaded on a hard drive or something like that.
So, very much like kind of the box set version
Yes.
of life, yeah.
Yes.
You know what? And sometimes I miss that version of
Oh, me
television
too.
anyway. I was
Me
just
too.
looking at I was going through I still have, like, a massive DVD collection actually, and I was going through all of those the other day, and I realized I was like, "Oh, there's, like, a year cutoff where I stopped buying DVDs because everything became streaming." But before that, like, my 2 prized possessions like, high school, middle school were, like, I have every box set of the Gilmore Girls
Oh,
shows
yes.
and every box set of the Greek television show, like, from ABC Family.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I had the biggest Barbie collection, like Barbie
Mm.
movies collection, and, my prized possession was that one CD that had all the Harry Potter movies on it. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. There's something about there's a permanence about it as we're
Mhm.
watching, like, things being taken off of streaming, and going to nowhere. There's nowhere to find them
No,
now.
actually, I have, like, a 2 terabyte hard drive that's still filled with, like, TV shows and movies and all the things that I've accumulated over, like, my time in high school. I used to have, like, a reputation in high school for being, like, the movie dealer or, like, the anime dealer or something like yeah. It was me and another classmate, and, like, he had all the cartoons, I had, like, anime and TV shows, and then at first it was me and him would swap shows, but then at a certain point, people would be like, "Oh, can I get this from you?" So, like, I just had the reputation of being, like, the TV show dealer. It was fun.
That is funny. I there's a sketch comedy show in that 100%. So when you started watching, you were watching with your dad. You mentioned you were like 8-ish, 8 years
Mhm.
old. And so you were living in Ethiopia at the time. When it became something that you were watching by yourself, had life changed at all, or did you really connect with it at a certain point?
I don't think my life changed necessarily. That was, what, 4th grade maybe for me. But it was more of I think I just really liked the TV show, and just, like, these group of nerds that got to, like, be nerds with adult money. I feel like that's a concept that, like, stuck with me.
Yeah.
Even if, like, back then, I think the only big fandom thing I was ever into was, like, Harry Potter, like, when I was 8, I think I read the books, but I wasn't really super into anything like that before then, but it just I was so happy watching them be happy being nerds that I think that really stuck with me.
Did you feel like at that time you were like a nerd that wasn't having that kind of happy experience? Or I know being a quote unquote nerd in that age group and beyond can be a rough time, which I guess is the sort of the euphoria of the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, I think that's sort of it. So, like, when I first started and as I was watching it, I was, like, getting super into, like, Harry Potter and super into Twilight, and then I got into the Vampire Diaries, and so it was and I realized I was slowly realizing that the level of into I was getting was, like, more than, like, my peers around me. Like, everyone liked the Harry Potter movies. I knew all the wands movements for all the spells, and I knew, like, the Latin origin for most of them. Keep in mind, I was, like, 10 at this point. Everyone was like, "Oh, cool, magic," and I was like, "And this is how you cast this specific spell." So, I was like, "Oh, maybe not everyone is as into things as I am," and I was very, like, super enthusiastic about it. I had a group of friends that I remember, like, at a certain point, I was like, "Let me teach you. Like, let's have a little charms class." Like, and they went along with it, bless them.
So you had that consciousness of like, I am enjoying this more than other people are enjoying it, or in a different way that at that young of an age?
Yeah, absolutely. Same thing with Twilight. I think, like, the last book in Breaking Dawn,
Mhm.
it's absolutely my favorite one just because of, like, all the different characters that got introduced, and then
Yeah.
I discovered, like, Fandom Wikia, and so I read on the backgrounds of each and every, like, slightly mentioned character, like, anyone from Riley and Bree Tanner to all the way to, like, the Egyptian coven, the, like, Irish coven, like, every single person, and I was just, like, consuming all the content I could find, whereas everyone was like, "Cool, final battle, that ended," and I was just like, "But actually."
I love that the shows that you mentioned that were like massive obsessions are these sprawling worlds that you really could get lost in. Like
Yeah.
I'm actually watching The Vampire Diaries for the first time right now, but that's another one where each small character that gets introduced, you're like, oh, I want a whole show about what's going on with them, or I want a
Mhm.
whole show about this. And especially with Breaking Dawn Part 2, like, oh, you could even the movie, you're like, well, where was Lee Pace's movie? I would have watched a whole mini series about his character and all of
Right?
those things. So you're kind of starting to obsess in the space of like both mythical, fantastical, and sort of rabbit hole-esque where you can really lose it.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
So with your sort of realization at that point, like, oh, I like things more than the average person, so to speak. Did you have any friends that were starting to go down that same level? It sounds like your friends were at least very nice to you about it and very supportive.
Yeah, I mean, like, elementary school was pretty chill, everyone was doing their own thing, so, I think The Vampire Diaries had reached, like, a fever pitch, I think that was around 6th grade, so I was, like, 11-ish. Yeah, it was really funny because it was, like, I was very into Twilight at that point, it was me and my best friend, and we were very into Twilight, and then her brother was like, "Oh, if you really want something cool with vampires," like, he was, like, I think, like, 2, 3 years older than us. He was like, "If you really want something really cool with vampires, then you should check out The Vampire Diaries," and that's, like, the rabbit hole I went down afterwards.
Yeah.
Um, so I think up until that point, even, like, Pretty Little Liars when I was, like, 7th, 8th grade, those were very, like everyone around me was kind of into them, so I wasn't that much of a freak about it, but, like, I knew a little bit more than other people did because 'cause I'm obsessive, but, like, it wasn't enough to, like, have people be like, "You're weird," because everyone was also into it, and sometimes,
Sure.
like, it's fun hearing extra, like, tidbits that you didn't know before, you know?
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I like it's actually nice to hear that it sounds like it was a wonderful experience. You just happened to be the one who was the most knowledgeable as opposed to the one who was like, why are you making lists about vampires?"
Yeah, it started to get a little judgy once I hit middle school,
Mm,
Because then I moved to a different country, and then so I moved to the UAE, and so it was a very different school with uh it was an interesting situation where I was, I think, like one of like three black people in my entire grade, like
yeah.
it was an interesting situation. And so I was very much still like, oh, I love all of these things. And people were like, why?
So, yeah, I'm interested actually as you're talking about that because it sounds like you've moved around and you've been in different spaces. You went from sort of like a space where everyone was on the same page to a space where you're sort of a fish out of water, so to speak.
Mhm.
And how did your relationship with fandom at that point change? It seems like growing up at the beginning, like elementary school, pre-middle school, you were able to sort of connect to things that everyone around you was connecting to, even if you were connecting a little bit more. And then if you're moving to a new space and you're sort of the only one who gets it, how did that change your relationship with that media and fandom itself?
I think it was like the when I went to a new school, I think that's when I got into like the transformative works aspect of like
Mm.
fandom. So like before, I think the very first fanfic I ever read was Twilight fanfic because I was like, oh, I can't believe this is over. I need more. But I think that was like the only one I read. I was like 11-ish. But then, like, once I got into the space where it was, like, a little bit more isolating in my nerdiness, I was like, "Maybe the internet can help me." Um, and then that's when I, like, really got into, like, fanfic, and this was on, like, fanfiction.net, so I didn't even know
Yeah.
what AO3. I only found out about AO3 when I was, like, in high school. So it was a lot of, like, fanfiction.net, and I just started binge reading just so much fanfic.
Oh, man, fanfiction.net in the Twilight era was a place to be.
It it surprisingly, it wasn't even Twilight fanfic that I mainly read. It was like so I got really into Artemis Fowl, like the book series.
Mm, yeah.
And then also Percy Jackson, that was also my Percy Jackson era. And then this other series called The Gallagher Girls. It's like this school for spies, but it's like an
Oh,
all-girls school
yeah.
for
I have never met someone who's read those books, but I read all of them religiously.
I still stalk the author on Instagram to this day. Like, she now has a
Those
new
were
book
so
coming
fun.
out. Like,
Ugh,
I'm
wow,
very
that because
happy.
the title of the first book is I'd tell you I love you, but then I'd have to kill you, and I was
Yes!
like, "What an incredible I am in 100%."
Each title of every single book was just banger after banger and made me so happy. But yeah, I was in that phase, and for some
Mhm.
reason, there was a lot of overlap between those fandoms. So I read a lot of fanfic where it'd be like characters from Harry Potter, Artemis Fowl, Percy Jackson, and the Gallagher Girls meet, and it'll be like sleepover, and they'll have like truth or dare and stuff. Like I read a surprising amount of fanfic that was like that, both on fanfiction.net and also on Wattpad.
Yeah, I think crossover fic is possibly something we haven't talked about on this show at all yet, and I think it's such an interesting part of sort of like the transformative space workspace of fandom, because a lot of times there's like these moments where people are looking at it and they're like, oh, this character and this character would make so much sense talking to each other, and I think a lot of it comes out of like archetypes of characters, like
Mhm.
the parts that you're talking about seem like they should have nothing in common, but obviously they all sort of have like kid who has extraordinary circumstance and therefore and a lot of times like school or summer camp. And so yeah, okay, why shouldn't they all hang out?
It was an interesting time. I think I'm not a big fan of crossover fic anymore, but like back then, like I consumed that a lot. I think archetypally, I feel like Artemis Fowl, like the character Artemis Fowl and Draco Malfoy are very similar in
Oh,
terms of like
interesting.
temperament and like character wise.
Uh-huh.
Which like I didn't realize this like when I was younger, but like the when I think about it now, they're very much like aloof, cold, kind of mean.
Mhm.
But also kind of like quote unquote the leaders in their like little groups kind of situation. So I always thought that was like a little snooty. Like,
Yeah, I think it's always interesting because it's like it's sort of that idea, there's nothing new under the sun. There's never been an
mhm.
original idea. And so it's interesting when you look at it and you're like, yeah, like it works because you're sort of looking at the same type of character in the same type of narrative with different circumstances. And if you put those two people together, it's interesting. I'm not sure what exactly forces us to like want to scratch that itch, I guguess, of like Styles Stilinski and Dean Winchester
Oh,
meet.
yeah.
Like people do love that one.
It's an
Um
interesting one.
yeah. And I think there was like a big Buffy and Twilight crossover era too.
I'm sure there was, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Buffy comes to slay Edward Cullen. It's always fascinating, but I guess it's just because it's a lot of times like you look at it and it's like, oh well, this piece of media is inspiring this piece of media, and I think a lot of times we don't give, especially in that age group, viewers credit for being able to recognize those types of things and to really want to live in that world and see those worlds collide.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, so as you're starting to like involve yourself in the kind of fanfic space and that era of life in middle school, were you starting to connect with other people who were enjoying that, but maybe not in person, maybe just over through like commenting or kudos or writing your own fic?
Yeah, a little bit of so on Wattpad, it's very interaction based. So I really like that about Wattpad. I would not go back on it anymore. But back then it was very like you'll read something, and then you can like inline comment on things, which
Oh,
was
okay.
absolutely my favorite thing. And I didn't read a lot of fanfic on Wattpad. Like I read some, but a lot of it was like original fic was what I would
Yeah.
read, like a lot of original works. And so there are stories from like that I read when I was like I don't know 13 that I will still reread because they were like that good. But
Yeah.
it would you'll have like a page of like some kind of dialogue and you could like highlight that word and just comment on that specifically and people will be commenting and it would take me like 4 times as long to finish a chapter just because I was reading everyone's
Really?
comments too because it's so funny.
That's interesting because I was never really I think Wattpad was sort of after my time by like maybe a year or two because or just in terms of how everything came out because I was on fanfic.net and then I moved on to AO3 pretty easily without anything in between. And so it's interesting because that sounds like both wonderful and chaos
Oh,
of
absolutely. 100% chaotic, and really fun because it'll be like, some character just betrayed the main character and it'll be like comments and it'll be like, "That bitch, how dare you?"
that almost sounds like almost replicating the experience of like watching television with a group of people in person.
Yeah, it feels like live blogging something basically,
Mm.
but it's like everyone's doing it at the same time. So it's just you're all reading this and you'll just have like I kid you not, there have been like it'll be like, "Oh, this one line," and you'll hover over it and be like 400 comments, and it'll just be like,
Wow.
"How would you like, why would you do this? Oh my god, why would you do this to me?" Like something like that.
I kind of love that. Like, I think that's such a cool way to experience something, especially because it's like, it's fan fiction. So it's being born out of loving something so much that you want to keep exploring it. And
Yeah.
then everybody who loves that so much is now live interacting with something that isn't going to happen on TV anyway.
Yeah, it's really fun. So that was my favorite thing about Wattpad, but then I would go to fanfic.net and then that's where I would read like most of my like fanfic crossovers, yes, but then I also read a lot of just Artemis Fowl fanfic by itself and also a lot of Naruto fanfic because I was a very big Naruto kid. I still am. um and
As you
then
should be. Wonderful.
yes. And then I like in terms of writing, I've written 2 pieces of fanfic that I've
Mhm.
published, but that, like, no one will ever know because it's on fanfiction.net, and I have changed my, like, username, and no one will ever find it.
I love it.
No one should ever be able to find it, but it was, like, the very first one I ever wrote was an Artemis Fowl fanfic,
Mhm,
and I remember I wrote this I had a beta reader that I
mhm.
ended up meeting from, like, Artemis Fowl fanfic. So they wrote a lot of, like, really good Artemis Fowl fanfic, and so I started interacting with them in terms of comments, and then you could private message people on, fanfiction.net
Yeah,
sometimes.
you could it was like a little, almost like an email inbox type of thing.
Yes. So
Yeah.
I ended up, like, reaching out to them and being like, "Hey, I really like your fics and stuff, and, like, do you have any advice for someone who would want to start out?" And they were like, "Yeah, just go ahead and write it. If you want, I'll beta read for you if you wanna write something. And I
Oh
was like,
wow.
oh, that sounds really cool. So I ended up like writing like this really short, like I think it was like a 1 page type thing. And then I wrote it and I sent it over and they looked it over and they were like, yeah, this all sounds good. Maybe just fix this little part. And I fixed it. And they were like, yeah, this looks really cool. You can go ahead and like post it. And I was like, yay. And it was like the most exciting thing I've ever gone through.
I love that. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't when people think about fan fiction, they don't necessarily recognize like how a lot of that is community based and how a lot of it can be about connecting with people versus sort of I think people who haven't been involved in fan fiction sort of think about fanfic and go, "Oh, like you just want to make two people kiss like over and over again." And I just think there's so much more to it and I love the idea of how many people you can sort of connect with and have that moment. And there's something really really nice and pure about the fact that you sort of connected with this person because they were writing something that made you happy, and then they
Yeah.
were like, "Well, I just want you to be happy too."
Yeah, it was so adorable. Like, I'm like now I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, that was so nice. I want to do
Yeah.
that for someone else. Like,
Yeah, I think that's the best part is like that community aspect of being able to sort of connect with people. And especially it sounds like maybe at the time you were in sort of a transitionary phase of life and trying to connect in some way to other people. And it's nice. It's just nice that the internet can do that.
yeah, and like in a way that, in a way that I'm not connecting to with people at school, I guess. Right.
Mhm.
Cause it's like, yeah, there were people that were like book nerds or like readers that I knew, but like again, no one as like intensely obsessed with things, like
Sure.
the second fanfic I ever wrote was Little Women fanfic. And this is because, yeah, this is just to explain how obsessive I get over things. It was my English teacher in like the 7th grade who was like, hey, I've seen you read a lot. Have you ever read the like classics? And I was like, no, I haven't. And she was like, oh, then you should start out with like she gave me a couple. It was like Pollyanna, The Secret Garden, things like that. And then she was like, here, try out Little Women. And there's like the original Little Women, and then there are like 2 additional books to it, Little Men and Joe's Boys, which is
Oh,
like, yeah. So it's
I had
like
no idea.
yeah, I don't think a lot of people do, but like my school library had it. And it was basically like Joe ends up having this little school for like orphans. So the Little Men is just like the stories of like all those little kids. And then
Okay.
the other one is like those kids have all grown up and are like going back to visit Joe. So it's very like cute. And
Yeah.
I read all of those. And then I was like, but I need more. And then I went on fanfiction.net and I found like maybe like 3 fanfics. And then I was like, if no one's gonna make it, I will.
That's so funny. Yeah, I honestly had no idea that there were more Little Women beyond I suppose no more Little Women, they were sort of Little Men, but, that's so funny, and I love that feeling of, like, I need more, because
Mhm.
I do feel like that is also part of where fan fiction comes from, of sort of, I desperately need anything. It doesn't matter what they're
Yep,
doing, I just need them to do
absolutely.
something. They could eat ice cream, and I would watch it.
Yeah, it was bad. I was like, I need more of these people interacting, and then I couldn't find any. So I'm like, you know what? I'll do it myself.
Did it spark because obviously it sounds like you've moved into, in your sort of adult life, you're studying psychology, which I there's probably quite a bit of writing involved in that, but a different type of writing. Um, and did it spark kind of back then any desire to be a storyteller or to involve yourself in that? Or was it really just from like, I desperately just need more, and if nobody's gonna give it, I'm gonna give myself more.
I think it was just a lot of the I just need more of this story kind of situation. I still write, but like just for myself sometimes, or like I do like NaNoWriMo, like the National
Oh,
Novel
sure.
Writing Month. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
been doing that since like 2015. I just like I'm like, this is fun. For a month I get to focus on nothing but writing. And I like that. I just do that. But it's usually for myself.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever finished a story. I just like the process of writing. But like writing for psych classes is very different. It's a lot of like, research papers or summarizing research papers or things like that. So it's very different type of writing. I don't quite enjoy it, but like the storytelling stuff is fun. But it was mostly like the fanfics I've written were very much like, I need more of this. And it was just sparked from that.
Yeah, I think sometimes I like what you touched on is this idea of like writing for yourself, having 1 month a year where you do that. I think sometimes we don't think a lot about the fact that you can have hobbies. Like everything that you
Mhm.
do doesn't have to be a career move. You can simply do things to enjoy yourself. You can be creative to enjoy yourself. And I'm glad that you have that. That's something I wish people were saying more often.
Yeah, it did take a little time for me to reconcile that idea, though. I know when I was, like, younger, I was like, "I wanna be an author," because it was, like, the next logical step of me consuming, like, hundreds of books in, like, a year, and then just being like, "Okay, well, now I wanna, like, create my own." But then it was very much like my parents were like, "You know, that sounds interesting. Maybe you could do that as, like, a side hobby because that probably won't make you any money." And, like, as a kid, I was very much like, "No, you're wrong." And now, like, I'm older, and I'm like, I don't think I could sustain writing, like, as a profession. Like, I can
Yeah.
barely finish a story for myself. Like, I
Yeah.
cannot imagine having to do it under pressure.
It's, not fun, let me tell you.
Mhm.
Well, something I'm curious about is that it sounds like a lot of your media that you were obsessive about was very much kind of escapist type of fantasy, media. Artemis Fowl, Percy Jackson, The Vampire Diaries, Twilight, all of those are shows or books or movies that have this big thing that's sort of happening underneath our reality. Was that something that you were very attracted to as a narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the things I read were very much like magic and like tons of world building. Like, I'm a sucker for world building.
Mhm.
Like kind of a side tangent. Like I love like Aragon, and then
Oh,
also
yep.
Christopher Paolini, like the his newest like book was a sci-fi book. And it was this thick volume that I like read through because I was like, this is fascinating. And then there was like a good 25-ish pages of just lore. Like him just being
Oh.
like, this is how like faster than light travel works. This is how like this was discovered. And I'm not gonna lie to you, like out of the 800 pages, that was my favorite part of the book. Like I was just like, yes, this is so good. And then that, like the little like made up science of the sci-fi, like it just made me so incredibly happy. Like this is how the rockets are built, and this is how they ended up like and like going to a separate like solar system. This is how humans spread across the solar system. I was just like, this is making me so incredibly happy. So yeah, anything with like a giant like sprawling like world building, I'm very very into. There was this other I read this when I was like older. I think I was in high school when I read this. So there's this series called The League Nemesis Rising. It's by Sherilyn Kenyon, and it's like first and foremost romance novels, right? It's like
Mhm.
one of those like each book focuses on a different person or like a different couple, but they're all like this part of a group. So very strong found family vibes, but then also like
Mm.
each person gets their own romance novel, like romance arc. But also it is a very much a space opera, but like that comes in very secondary to the romance. Like a lot of it is just like what's happening to put these two characters together, but at the background there's like an entire intergalactic war happening. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I read those books. Yeah, the romance was good, but I was so obsessed with what was happening in the war. Like I was like, each book I would be going to, and I'm just like, cute couple, but what's happening? And then like I remember at some point in like the ninth book or something, they did a parallel timeline type of situation where like as the previous book was happening, so was this. And so we're just like back in time. And I'm like, I already know what's happening at this point in time. I need you to tell me what's going on with the war.
Like, "Please, I came here for a Star War, and, you are not delivering."
I'm like, cute couple, let's move on.
So you really are attracted to that kind of building, the world building aspect of it versus
Yeah.
necessarily, like, the small character moments.
Yeah, I really love world building. Like, not to say that I don't love character driven stories, I absolutely
Sure.
do. But the things that I get super invested in tend to be the ones with like big, like lots of world building. Like anything like Lee Bardugo's like Grishaverse that had me
Mm.
hooked in high school. Like just anything that has world building elements or like, oh, this is a world that is not our own and I have made up all of this stuff in it, just really gets to me.
I love that. I think something I'm wondering about is that The Big Bang Theory is certainly not that at all. So
No.
so what was it that it sounds like almost honestly like one of the few pieces of media that is not a big world building, big lore world that you were interested in. So what was it about The Big Bang Theory that kind of stood out to you as this formative piece of media that maybe was a bigger deal than something like The Vampire Diaries or one of these space opera romance wars going on?
I think one is that aspect of friend group, right? Like
Hmm.
I have good friends, but I've always wanted like, like a group of friends that you're like so super close with and like you share things and you're all like obsessive nerds about things together and like I've never had that. Like I've met people who are like really like invested in things and I thought that was super cool and I love hanging out with those people. But I've never had like a core friend group that like we shared so many different interests that we overlap and things like that. So I think that was one aspect of it. And also like I said earlier, that idea of like not outgrowing your passions or like your obsessions, right? Because it's a lot of like, at least I grew up hearing like, oh, when you're older, you won't like this anymore. Like to this day, I'm a very big fan of cartoons. I love cartoons. I watch a lot of cartoons. I will get into very heated debates about cartoons. um, and it was just like, I would hear a lot of like, oh, like it's just because you're young. Like you'll probably get over it when you're older. And I'm like, I'm 21. I will still watch cartoons and I will fight anyone who tries to take away my cartoons from me. Right. So it's like that idea of like these people all have like PhDs and have like real people jobs and like are living by themselves and they're still nerds and they're and like they'll spend money on things that they think is cool, right?
Yeah.
Like the Big Bang Theory, I think is also like a very big reason of why like in middle school I got bullied ish and
I
about
loved
like
that people can't see the hand motion that you just made, but
I
that
know.
was my favorite way anyone's ever talked about being bullied.
I was bullied ish.
Like with a little shrug.
Yeah. But it was like the stuff that got said never got to me because I never took nerd or geek as like an insult. Like,
Hmm.
and I think projecting myself onto the Big Bang Theory was a very big reason for that because I didn't see that as a bad thing. I was like, yes, I'm super passionate about stuff. What of it? I'm kind of sad that you don't have anything to obsess about, truth be told. Like,
Yeah, I think that is such a that part is like the true part of it is when you sometimes it's hard to see when you're young and I love that you were able to see it when you were young, but the part that's more sad is like, yeah, I have something that I love, that I enjoy, that brings me joy and I talk about it and I'm really sad that you don't. Like
yeah.
that's a bummer for you.
Exactly. I'm like, what do you talk about? Like, what you're sitting here talking about boys. I'm over here talking about the episode of the Justice League I watched yesterday. We're not the same.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it's like what do you think about at night? Like
yeah.
what do you do with all of your time if you just don't have something that makes you feel that way?
No, and genuinely, like, I had a lot of free time in middle school. I went to a school that assigned homework once a week. I had
Oh.
homework on Fridays. Yeah. So and school ended at 2 p.m. So I
What a
had just
joy.
hours and hours to do absolutely nothing. So I consumed so much content
Yeah.
like in 7th and 8th grade. Just whether that's fan fiction or like TV shows or like books. I read so many books. Like having unbarred access to a library, I think saved my mother a lot of money with the speed I get through books. Like the
Yeah.
fact that I had a library card really helped her wallet. Like
Yeah, I know the feeling. So, when you're looking at these characters at the time who are sort of adults, as you said, they're adults with PhDs and real money, and they're still passionate about the things that they love. Were some of those things that you were passionate about? You mentioned the Justice League. Were you watching those characters also be passionate about the things that you loved at the time?
so it's very interesting. When I first started watching The Big Bang Theory, I think the only thing we had in common in terms of like being obsessed with was Harry Potter. They didn't speak a lot about Harry Potter, but I know they mentioned it a couple of times. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. So I was never into the stuff they were into. But then I was like, I really want to try these things. Like, how are they so obsessed with these?
Mm.
So The Big Bang Theory is definitely the reason why I got into a lot of the geeky stuff I got into. Like, I'm a very big DC Comics fan. And I definitely would not have gotten into comics or like the DC animated universe or the DC universe in general, if it wasn't for the Big Bang Theory, right? So I got really hardcore into like Justice League. I ended up watching the whole of Young Justice. I watched a lot of like the Batman movies. Like that was my thing because of it. I got into Star Wars because of them. Comic-Con was like the biggest like dream of mine to get to. And I still will at some point, but I know like where I'm living now, there is we have like a local like Comic-Con type event and I go there like every year. Like every year. I've already bought my tickets for this year's like show. It's in April. I'm definitely going. It's right after final season, so it's excellent timing. Like
So it really gave you almost like a roadmap for your taste going forward.
oh yeah, absolutely. Like it was the biggest reason why I got like, yeah, comic book. I got into Doctor Who.
Hmm.
And then I got on Tumblr and then got into Super Wholock. And that was an
Yeah.
interesting situation in of
So you
itself.
have someone specific to blame for
Yes.
a very traumatic part of your life.
I blame Sheldon and Leonard for getting me into the interesting hellhole that was Super Wholock. But
Yeah. Well, so I actually think that's so cool that you were able to sort of like connect with it sounds like the thing that was driving you into being interested in these characters was like the passion that
Mhm.
they had, not necessarily what they had passion for. And then connecting to that, you were able to be like, well, if this character likes this thing so much, I'm definitely going to feel the same way.
Yeah, kind of like that. Because watching them interact with the stuff they love very much reminded me of how I am when it came to like the stuff I'm obsessed with. So I was just like, huh, maybe I should check these out. Maybe I would be interested in them. And so, yeah, it was like I watched Star Wars The Clone Wars when it was on Cartoon Network when I was like very young. And I thought it was like cool, but I never like pursued it. But then like after watching The Big Bang Theory, I'm like, actually, I'm going to watch the Star Wars movies. Let's see what the hype is about. And so, I had a friend who really fought me over the fact that I watched it in the wrong order.
Meaning you watch them in number order
Yeah.
instead of release order.
So I watched the
Incorrect, but
prequels
that's
first.
okay.
Yeah, I know. I realized like now that I did it wrong because everyone was like, "Oh my god, it was such a big surprise!" Like, spoiler alert, like Vader was Luke's father, and I was like, "Really?" Because I knew this.
You're like, 'cause I watched them in order, so
Yeah, and my friend looked at me in the eyes, and he was like, "I can't believe you did that." I was like, "I didn't
so
know any
funny.
better."
I'm honestly surprised that you made it through because if you watched the prequels first, those are famously hated by everyone.
I
So you
find that
continued
so
watching.
funny. I loved them.
Oh, that's great. I'm happy that you had that experience. I think it's probably that the original, so to speak, films, which are, you know what? I blame George Lucas because if you want people to watch things in a certain order and you name them 4, 5, and 6,
I
and then
know.
1, 2, and 3, it is very confusing.
True. Very true.
Maybe the right way is to watch them in that order because then you can enjoy them all. You know what? Maybe you've changed my mind in 4 seconds of me trying to tell you you were wrong. I love that you were sort of able to kind of connect with what we sort of talk about on the show, which is like connecting with the passion of someone. Like we've covered so many different topics on this show that it's not possible as for even for me, like a lot of times I haven't heard of these things or I haven't watched them and I'll watch them just to prepare to be able to talk about the show. And then I find things that I'm like, "Oh, I really like that." And it's almost like it's just because it's the passion that someone is able to speak with and say like this thing was so important to me that you're interested in it purely because you're like, "Well, I want to know why that invokes such a passionate response." And it sounds like that was almost what you were then using to build sort of the things that you then became that same passion about with The Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, absolutely. That was definitely my journey.
That's wonderful. I think also The Big Bang Theory, one thing I was gonna ask you about is it does kind of have, because it's a sitcom, people are sort of like, oh, it's, it's The Big Bang Theory. It's kind of whatever. And so I'm curious, when you love something as much as you can that maybe has like a not a negative connotation, right? It's not like people were like, that's the worst show on earth, but it's sort of the idea of like, it's a silly sitcom. It's about those geeks. How do you kind of navigate when people are negative in some way or dismissive in some way of what you like?
That's interesting. I think I've had this conversation, two separate conversations with two separate people. One is I have a friend who doesn't like laugh tracks, and I'm like, I will defend laugh tracks because sometimes I just don't want to be thinking about when I should laugh. Like that's just my thing. Sometimes I'm gonna laugh along with things, and that makes me happy. And another friend who's like a film major, and he was like, I don't like it when things make it so obvious how you're supposed to feel. And I think that's interesting, I guess, but I'm a big fan of like that. That was in a conversation about K-dramas because K-dramas are very heavy-handed with their music and stuff and like how you're supposed to be feeling when this is happening. I think it works for me. That's basically it. So whenever someone's being like dismissive about something, my thing is just, well, it works for me, so leave me alone.
I like that. Yeah, there's the idea that like not everything is made for you, and
Yeah.
that's fine. But in defense of laugh tracks, something I will say is that I do think laugh tracks teach you comedy and joke setups
Mhm.
in a way that you don't necessarily realize you're being taught. Because if you're watching something and you're like, okay, I mean, I think maybe I'm supposed to laugh and you're not sure. Having the audience sort of laugh track of people laughing also teaches you like, oh, that was a setup, that was a punchline. And now I know if I want to tell a joke, here's how I tell the joke. I get the format of a joke, which I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that's actually a good thing.
No, absolutely not. And I think it also like shapes your humor and stuff. Like I know as a person whose first language wasn't English, right?
Hmm.
My sense of sarcasm was heavily inspired by Chandler from The Big Bang Theory. Like
Mm.
no, sorry, from Friends. Chandler from
Friends.
Friends.
I was
What the
like, wait a
heck?
minute.
Chandler from Friends.
Yeah,
No, because it was very much like I feel like if you didn't know what sarcasm was, you wouldn't know that that was meant to be funny.
sure.
So it was very much like that really dry humor, like I learned from Chandler. And there was also like one of my favorite episodes from The Big Bang Theory is how like Sheldon couldn't understand sarcasm. So there would be like times where like Leonard would write sarcasm on like a piece of like cardboard, and like I think Penny would like sass Sheldon, he wouldn't understand, so Leonard would be in the back with like the sign that said sarcasm, which is very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Is so when you mentioned English wasn't your first language, did you learn English in a like traditional class sense, like in school, and then learn tone as you're speaking of like and nuance from sort of sitcom and TV?
It's very interesting because I was very young when I learned English, so I don't
Mm.
fully remember. I do know that I was able to speak English in like the first and second grade.
Hmm.
I know like I'm sure we learned it in a school setting, yes. But then also like I said, I watched a lot of cartoons, right? I credit the fact that I have this accent to Cartoon Network. Like I watched a lot of cartoons like when I was younger, and then Nuance I think also came from that, like watching all those cartoons and stuff. You like it's very like quote unquote like natural way of people interacting. So it wasn't like in a classroom I was learning how to do things. It was very much like I'm watching my favorite characters talk to each other. And whichever one I liked most, you kind of try and imitate. And then additional nuances came from when I started watching like sitcoms and stuff. Then you're like further ways of people communicating, right? Because again,
Sure.
when cartoons are like aimed for kids, it's the way things are phrased and stuff are like meant for kids. But then like you watch like stuff meant for like adults, and you're like, okay, so this is how people communicate.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I think it's like I personally am very bad at languages, like at learning languages. And I wish I would put more effort in. You know what? No, I take it back. I have put a lot of effort in. I'm just really bad at it. And I think one of the things that I do find interesting when people talk about it, I have a friend who learned English. French was his first language, and he learned English from watching Lost with the subtitles, like French subtitles, as opposed to because they weren't dubbing it in France at the time, and everybody was trying to watch it like as it came out.
Mhm.
Um, and so a lot of people, when they talk about watching television, that's the part that teaches sort of the nuance of language and the nuance of communication. Because as I think we all should know and recognize more often, English is like the most chaotic. It makes no sense. Like
Absolutely.
if I had to learn English, I would be losing it because I can't learn languages that have clear structure and, and verb conjugations and everything makes sense. So English makes no sense. And I think that's, we should just all know that. We should all just acknowledge it.
No,
And so yeah.
100%. No, because like one of the things I'm very incredibly passionate and a nerd about is languages
Mhm.
in general, right? So officially I'm bilingual, but I I did French for like 9 years. Don't ask me to help you at any point in any French speaking place. I was in Montreal like a few weeks back. I got so scared I switched to English. I was like, no, we're not doing this. I'm trying Spanish because a lot of my friends are like Spanish speakers. And then I'm currently in Arabic class because I was like, hey, my last few years of university, I might as well try and learn a language. And because I lived in the UAE when I was younger and it's very close to my mother tongue, which is Amharic. I'm like, I might
Mhm.
as well learn this. And then also, like I said, I watch K dramas. So I picked up quite a bit of like Korean. I'm very big fan of anime, especially when I was in high school. So, you pick up like Japanese that way. And then I watched a bunch of shows when I was in 11th grade. There was this set of shows called Scam. They're like, it
Oh,
was
I've watched
originally
that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Norwegian. Yeah.
Yes. Facebook made an English version of it, which was like Scam Austin.
Oh, terrible. I hated it. It was the worst of the bunch because I've watched the different language ones and like the ranking is the Norwegian first and
Yeah.
then the Italian one next and then the French one and then everything else I couldn't care less about. But through Scum, I picked up quite a bit of Norwegian, right? So I
Yeah.
understand when people say they learned a language through a show. I am very impatient in terms of like wanting to know things.
Mm,
So I kind of quit at a certain point. So I could never get to the level of fluency people get to through watching TV shows. But
yeah.
I think it's very interesting that people can learn languages just through watching, like consuming media. I know people who like learned English through reading fanfic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I've heard of people like I think I've seen people on Tumblr, they're like, "Yeah, I learned English through reading English fanfic because like, there wasn't enough in Spanish or something like that. Like, there wasn't enough
Oh,
fanfics in
wow.
Spanish
Yeah.
to sustain me, so
To
I
see.
learned to read English."
See, that's the power of fandom.
Mhm,
Like, I have no need
absolutely.
except for the fact that I need more.
Yeah,
Um, I guess I'll learn English. I love that.
yeah,
Yeah, I find it really interesting because I also think it speaks to sort of the power of television in general, because I think one of the things you talked about was, like, tone indication and watching Sheldon not understand sarcasm, and then you also talked about watching Desperate Housewives at a young age where things were going over your head,
yeah,
but learn obviously understanding them now later as an adult, and I feel like one of the things that TV does, whether it's a sitcom, which is really clear about what you should be feeling and what you're thinking and how these characters are feeling, or whether it's something that perhaps appeals to your film friend where they don't tell you anything about how you should be feeling and you should interpret it, is that it gives you sort of the understanding of people and characters and the nuance of sort of human interaction, whether that's comedy or whether that's English or whether that's sarcasm or whether that's sort of romance or any of those things. You actually start to pick up this is how people interact. And I feel like people who don't spend as much time enjoying things in that way, like you mentioned, like what do you think about all day? Like I think it also teaches you how to be more of a human being and also understand other human beings.
yeah, fully. You get, like, such a diverse cast of characters in terms of, like, personalities that you're like, "Huh, not everyone thinks like me," you know?
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you're maybe not experiencing a lot of different people. Like I think a lot of us growing up, regardless of where it is, like as a kid, you just don't get to leave your bubble as much because you are a child. Like you go to school, you come home.
True.
Um and so I think it kind of helps you understand that there are other types of people in the world and how to interact with them. And I almost wish more people watch sitcoms too, because I think that gives you a clearer version of people in general. Like, even when you're talking about The Big Bang Theory, you have Penny who comes in and is a very different person who's experiencing these people as well. And the idea of like nerdiness to an intense degree, of someone who doesn't understand sarcasm when it's like really all she knows how to communicate, like that
Mhm.
is her sense of humor. And I think it's that The Big Bang Theory itself is a little bit of turning that character. Like, Sheldon would normally be the fish out of water, but Penny's the one who kind of stands out.
Yeah.
Which she's the, I'm putting big air quotes around this, but the normal girl, like the normal hot girl next door.
Mhm.
And to make her the fish out of water, was that something that also appealed, of seeing the characters that you may be more related to being the ones who were the baseline of what's acceptable? There's more of us than there is of you.
Yeah, I think that was interesting. I didn't think of it in those specific terms, but I
Sure.
think one of my favorite things was like the slow, like nerdification of Penny, where at a certain point she started understanding what the guys were saying, which I found so funny. Like she like at a certain I think she there was an episode where she had like a full she explained an entire like really nerdy I think it was like a Star Trek thing or something to someone else, and I think like Leonard almost cried. So yeah, I think her having being like the typical popular girl and you know the typical like hot girl, and then coming into the space where every single person is a nerd,
Yeah.
was very like yeah, she was the odd one out, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I think Kaylee Cuoco does a good job of it too. Like, it's not necessarily like the dumb blonde girl. It is just sort of like, I am so overwhelmed. I have no idea what you're talking about, but I'm
Mhm.
gonna I but she also is not mean about it. There's something sweet about that. Like, she is not like, she doesn't write them off and she still hangs out with them. And then not only that, but like you're talking about, she sort of assimilates. Like, she sort of like
Yeah.
is like, yeah, you're that passionate about it. I guess I'll figure it out.
Yeah. Like, she'll have, like, moments where, like, Sheldon will say something, like, very nerdy, and then she would, like, respond to him, like, with equal knowledge about, like, the thing he's talking about, and then she'll, like, look back, and she's like, "I can't believe I just said that," and will walk away. And I just find that so funny.
I really find that show to have a lot of heart that people don't necessarily like realize until they watch it, but it is something that I think like it's almost built off of just like two different groups of people, or two different types of people seeing the goodness in each other and sort of learning a little bit about each other. And there's something heartwarming in that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with heartwarming.
Yeah, absolutely, you know?
Well, the one thing I'm also curious about is, it sounds like you moved into sort of a scientific and logic-based profession that you're pursuing in psychology. Was that a passion that kind of you remember a turning point where you got interested in that? Was we talked before we started recording about the idea of like combining psychology and fandom in those spaces and understanding them. You've also talked a bit about like needing more of these characters interacting and seeing how they speak to each other, which can be a little bit, it sounds a little bit like of a psychology experiment to some degree. Was fandom and The Big Bang Theory and different shows and understanding those characters something that led you to those interests, that led you to where you are now?
You know, I don't think I ever related my interest in psych to the fandom, aspect of my interests. I don't know, I think I hit, like, the 7th grade, and I was like, "Okay, you know what? People are confusing. I wanna know what makes them tick," was very much, like, my, spark. Like, it wasn't
Yeah.
that I was very much, like, an outcast or anything like that, it was just very much I'll be in an interaction with people, and I'm like, "I still don't know what is happening."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "How do people work? Like, why is everyone so different? Like, this is very fascinating to me. I wanna learn more about this." So that's kind of where my interest in psych came. And also, I've always had a very, like, logical kinda, like, mind. Like, my favorite subject in school was math, right? Like, my favorite, first year course in university was, like, calculus.
Yeah.
I was, like, I was very much like bio and chem in, like, high school. So that was just kind of my brain's inclination is towards, like, sciencey stuff. Interestingly, I'm not a fan of doing psych research. I'm a fan of reading it, right? It's
Mm.
so it was very like, I think after I got into psych, I was like, hmm, this is an interesting profession for someone who hates research. Like, right? Like I'm not a big fan of doing research, especially because they really hammer it into you, right? Especially in
Right.
psychology, because the field itself is trying its best to like keep up with like STEM, which makes it like very different from all the other social sciences. And I think literally any other social science would have like suited me a little bit better in terms of like the discussions I wanted to have and like the kind of stuff I wanted to read up on.
Yeah.
Like that stuff I'm getting to now in like my like third and fourth years is when I'm like hearing the stuff that I'm really like, yes, this is so fascinating to me. Whereas like the first few years is very much like, here's how you do research, here's how you do stats, here, and I'm just like, I just want to read about this. Like, I don't want to like
Yeah.
do it. Yeah, so it's very being here like halfway through. I'm like, actually, I kind of don't want to go into like higher level psych. I kind of want to go into like social work instead. It's a lot more
Mm.
hands-on and it still goes with what I want to do. Um, and also I don't have to do research. Like that, like a very big selling point of that was like, I don't want to be doing this stuff.
Yeah. You're like, I do not. No, no, thank you.
No, thank
Collecting
you.
data is not interesting. I would like to read it.
Yes. I'm like, hand me a journal. I'm so happy to go through the entire thing, but tell me to run an experiment and I might fight you. Like,
I do like the idea that like what drove you is this idea of like what makes people tick.
mhm.
Because as you've talked about throughout, you kind of went through a path of you've lived different places, you've been in different environments, you've been in places where you connected with people, and then you've been in places where you haven't connected with people. And around the same time that you're talking about, like middle school, seventh grade, where you were like, I need to understand people, also seems like it was around the time where people were like, we don't understand you. Like, we don't
Yeah.
get why you're this passionate. Um, and it's interesting that your inclination was not sort of to change yourself to fit that group, but to be like, what's going on under there? Let's let's study you under a microscope."
Yeah, I mean, like, this is like adult contemplation. There's definitely points like when I was younger, when I was just like, what if I just like tried to fit in? And like, there were
Mm,
points where I definitely tried my best to do that. But like, I really wanted to get along with people and try and talk about the same things they do and stuff. But the stuff I really liked gave me so much joy that I'm like,
mm,
maybe I don't want to like diminish myself in order to fit in, right? Because I'm just like,
yeah.
listen, if I just want to stay home and binge through the entire season of Justice League Unlimited, that brings me a lot more joy than going out to a party. So
Yeah. One of the things that you've talked about with The Big Bang Theory appealing to you at such a young age, but also now and in between, was this idea that they were adults who hadn't given up on what they loved and now were in a position almost to enjoy it in an adult manner. Do you think that like promise of the future possibility was something that helped you recognize how much you enjoyed what you enjoyed and you didn't want to sort of cut it out of your life to fit in?
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely, because yeah, I'm still incredibly passionate about the stuff that I really love, and I've gotten like, a taste of having some adult money, like, I I did, like, a year-long internship, like, halfway through my degree, and so I was making money, and that went into a lot of nerdy stuff, like, I got to, like, our version of Comic-Con, and I don't know, I think I spent, like, $200 on merch, like, I have an
Yeah.
entire nerd shrine in my room, it's, like, my favorite place in my room, like, and I'm like, "Wow, if I had even more adult money, I can think of all the things I can do with this."
Yeah, I think there's something in there that I'm really glad it sounds like The Big Bang Theory gave you that a lot of kids don't have and it takes a while to come back to, which is sort of like the fact that the world is bigger than you are in right now. And I wish I'd had something like this as well and maybe I should have been watching The Big Bang Theory as a kid, but something that sort of gives you the idea that like okay, if these aren't your people, there are people there eventually, and there will be a world where like you can kind of just do what you want. Like you don't have to change who you are just because at this moment it doesn't work with what's around you. The world is so small when you're a kid, but you also don't recognize that it's that small because you it's the biggest thing that's ever happened to you. And I do love that it sounds like the Big Bang Theory just sort of promised you just if you just get out of here, one day you're gonna be able to do whatever you want. So just hold on to the things that you love. It's very lovely, very lovely sentiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that actually probably has brought us full circle. So I might just ask you the final question that I asked everyone, which is if you had never seen The Big Bang Theory, what would be different about you today?
You know, I definitely think I wouldn't be as openly nerdy as I am now. I would still be like an avid consumer of things. Just it'll probably have been just books and maybe like TV series, but it wouldn't have been these big overarching like things like comic books. Like I'm very into like DC comics, right? I wouldn't have probably wouldn't have gotten into like Doctor Who or anything of like the nerdy like fandom side of things. I think I would have just been like, all right, I watched it. I've read like all the things I can about it, and then I'm just gonna move on kind of situation. And yeah, I just don't think I would have the same confidence I would like in being a nerd or like that same pride I have in being a nerd, right? And that's not to say that like Big Bang Theory doesn't have its issues, right? Like it's
Sure.
not the most diverse of shows. Um,
It's a soft way to put it. Yeah.
yeah, like you know, you have the one person of color in there.
Yeah.
It's very fun. And I hated how they handled his character too. But it's like Raj, like I'm not a
Yeah.
fan of like that ending of he was the this I'm sorry, I'm just gonna go on a bit of a rant on this because
Yeah.
it upsets me to no end. He was the one character out of all of them that really wanted to be with somebody. And he was the only character that didn't end up with
Yeah.
somebody. And I feel like they did him so dirty. And I am so upset about it. I watched all the way to the finale and I'm so upset about that.
Oh, poor Raj.
I know.
At least they beat Friends. They, in terms of
True.
in terms of
But you know,
it's not a hard one to beat, but
not a difficult one to beat, you know?
'cause, yeah, so you feel like it like The Big Bang Theory is what really allowed you to be openly passionate and to sort of continue going through things as opposed to quietly passionate.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's a wonderful thing to be though. So I am glad that you got to see it and that it gave you that sort of promise for later and to allow yourself to keep it. Cause I think I think the thing that you've talked about that's really admirable, especially at an early age to be able to see is I could try to fit in, but it's not gonna make me happy. Like the thing that I like is making me much happier and bringing me much more joy. And I think it takes a really strong sense of self to be able to make that decision anyway to keep yourself in what's bringing you joy as opposed to what may bring you connection is not the right word because it wouldn't be a genuine one, but what may bring you a place among the masses, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah.
um so so yeah, I think it's wonderful, and I think it's been really wonderful to talk to you about this. I've really enjoyed our conversation and
Oh my
hearing
god.
about your journey.
Thank you so much. It's like, yeah, it's kind of a little like surreal to me meeting like my favorite podcast creator. It's kind of like, oh my god, this is crazy.
Oh, that's it's very kind. It's very surreal for me for someone to say that about me. So we're in a you know what? I feel like we're recreating your moment of your Artemis Fowl beta reader
Yeah,
experience. So
absolutely. It's very much, yeah. It's like you, and if I ever get to meet Mike Schubert, like I could die happy. Like that's very much where I am.
he does live shows. He's on tour. I highly recommend.
He's on tour in Vancouver, and now I'm like, can I afford to fly out to Vancouver? Is where I am right now. We will come back to this in a
We
couple
will
of
see.
weeks.
Well, thank you so much. And it's just honestly, it was just really lovely to meet you and get to talk to you. So I really enjoyed it and I appreciate you sharing and being willing to talk about it. I guess to maintain that one thing that sounds like it makes you you, which is to be passionate and be loud about being passionate about things. So I appreciate you sharing that with me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a really great time.
Yeah, of course. Between now and next Wednesday, if you want to keep in touch, you can follow me on social media at Marissa Kamari, anywhere you get your social media fix. You can also sign up for my newsletter by going to our website, tandemproductions.com, clicking on You Are What You Love, and signing up there. I send out an issue with every episode of this podcast. And we just started a Discord server, so if you want to connect with me, with other listeners, and talk about the types of things that we are talking about on this show, you can join that by clicking on the link in the episode description. Until next Wednesday, I hope you are enjoying what you love.